Fairy Tail 100 Years Quest might not be worth reading after all. The sequel to Fairy Tail has been out for years. It's been relatively successful, and a lot of Mashima fans even like it more than Eden Zero. In fact, it's so popular that it got an anime announcement over a year ago. To be fair, there are some that happen way before an anime is released, but this was announced back in September of 2021. So at this point, there's a serious question. Is 100 Years Quest really worth reading? As someone who is admittedly behind but has actually read the manga, I would say that answer depends. In fact, I'd say there's a different answer for at least 4 kinds of fans. The first one should go without saying, but I just want to be clear. I would not recommend 100 Years Quest as a starting point to new fans. When I started the manga, I remember kind of thinking that it might be a good place for new fans. The characters start out on a new mission, the mission being that they have to slay the 4 dragon gods on a new continent. They kind of ease into things and you get a sense of the chemistry and the character dynamics right away. Plus, a lot of the plot is new content, so you don't have to know everything from the original. You don't need to know anything about the previous villains since the dragon gods are all new villains. You don't need to know anything about the mysterious white mage because this is also a completely new villain. And of course, the characters are on a continent they haven't explored yet, so the adventures they go on lend themselves to new fans. But at the same time, there's just so much going on that you hit a certain point early on where it all just goes right over your head. First of all, if you care about spoilers, then absolutely do not start here. I know that sounds pretty obvious, but sometimes sequels do a decent job of not explicitly mentioning things in previous titles. 100 Years Quest makes no such reservations. If you don't know anything about the power system, then that's a bummer too, since 100 Years Quest doesn't really spend time re-explaining anything. Not that Fairy Tail's power system is anything complex, but if you're the kind of person who enjoys knowing how each ability works, then you're better off starting with the original. Plus, while this does take place on a new continent, you're still missing out on all of the world building that happens in the original. So would I recommend 100 Years Quest to someone looking to get into Fairy Tail as a new fan? No. While I do think Mashima writes in a way where anyone can enjoy it and have fun regardless of how much they know about the original, there's just way too much context that you need from Fairy Tail in order to fully enjoy this sequel. Plus, if you have any intention of going back to read the original, then you're going to be spoiled on just about everything. If, however, you don't care about spoilers and you just want to read 100 Years Quest because it looks fun, then by all means I say go for it. You'll still have a good time reading the series. Now, having said all that, it kinda sounds like I've narrowed it down. If you shouldn't read 100 Years Quest if you haven't read Fairy Tail, then only people who finished Fairy Tail should read it, right? Well, no. There is the possibility that you either watched or read Fairy Tail and didn't finish it because at some point or another, you just decided it wasn't for you. Maybe the series was too long. Maybe you didn't like how certain arcs played out. Maybe you really didn't like the fan service. But you saw people enjoying 100 Years Quest and you saw those gorgeous volume covers and thought, you know what, maybe I'll try it too. Should you check out the sequel? Well, before I answer that question, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. Now, to answer that question, it really comes down to a question of how different 100 Years Quest is from the original. There is, of course, the change in artist, which I think looks really good while still honoring the original style. But that's not really what we're getting at. What we're getting at is how does the sequel improve on some of the weaker parts of the original. First, I'd say the plot is better. Not in a general sense, but more in terms of how it flows. It has its ups and downs, but I'd say the plot in the sequel is generally more focused. This is due in part to A, the fact that Mashima is only storyboarding, meaning he can focus more energy on planning the story, and B, the fact that 100 Years Quest was created with a clearer end goal. Whereas Mashima just made up the original series as he went along, 100 Years Quest opens with a very clear goal: slaying the dragon gods and completing the 100 Years Quest. Obviously that goal evolves over time, but it gives the plot direction throughout the story. Now, aside from that, I wouldn't really say 100 Years Quest is drastically different from the original. The characters have some new changes, and some might get more fights than in the original, but they're all basically the same characters, and they all have the same quirks. And of course, there is still plenty of fan service. In fact, I still remember starting this series, questioning whether Lucy's fan service was ever this over the top, and having to go back to the original to confirm that it really was. So for those of you who didn't love Fairy Tail but are maybe looking to rekindle some of that original nostalgia, here is my recommendation. If you generally enjoy Fairy Tail but just didn't enjoy some of the arcs, I'd say give 100 Years Quest a chance. But if you don't like anything about Fairy Tail and hate all of Mashima's tropes, then don't get your hopes up. So now that I've given my recommendation to brand new fans as well as people who don't like Fairy Tail, there's 2 recommendations left. People who love Fairy Tail but just haven't started 100 Years Quest, and casual fans who've only seen the anime. So let me get the easy one out of the way first. If you have read Fairy Tail, then I would definitely recommend 100 Years Quest. I know this sounds kind of obvious, but there's plenty of series that get sequels that turn out to be less than what people were hoping for. Sometimes they even hurt the original. Thankfully, that's not the case here. I definitely wouldn't say you have to read 100 Years Quest. It's not like you're missing out on something that was missing from Fairy Tail. However, there is a lot of stuff that's added to the story that you'll enjoy if you've read the original. First of all is the 100 Years Quest itself, something that was hyped up a number of times in the original series. Then there's the plot surrounding the dragon gods. There's all kinds of new abilities, including a new kind of dragon slayer magic. On that note, there's also new guilds that are introduced. We also see a lot of popular characters appear in this story, such as Sting and Sabretooth, Brandish, and even Zeref. But I won't say anything more on that. All I will say is that if you love Fairy Tail and you want to see what all the hype is about, then I highly recommend reading the sequel. Which brings us to our last group. Say you watched the anime but you never read the manga, or you did but you never really read that much of it. You know that the sequel got an anime announcement, so you'd like to check out the manga while you're waiting. Should you read 100 Years Quest? Well, that depends. If you only want to read it because you're waiting for the anime, then I'd probably say no. If you're like me and you'd like to go into certain anime not knowing what'll happen, then I don't think you should start the manga. The anime was announced over a year ago, and at this point it seems like it'll be 2 years before we get any more information. At this rate, you could start the manga right now and be caught up before they mention anything else about the anime. By then, you might not even bother watching the anime. Now, if you're not just waiting for the anime and you want to get into the manga, I'd generally say yes. If you've only seen the anime, then you know everything you need to know in order to start the sequel. But I will say this, I recommend reading the original manga as well. There's some differences between the anime and manga that you would never know about, such as the display of more blood and gore that's censored in the anime. Plus, you don't really appreciate the evolution of Mashima's art style if you've only seen the anime. Now, it'd be unreasonable to torture yourself and wait hundreds of chapters just to start 100 Years Quest, so by all means start there and go back once you're caught up. But that's if you want to get into the manga. So those are my recommendations. If you're a brand new fan or you hate Mashima, I wouldn't recommend the sequel. But if you want to get into the manga or you want to see why Mashima fans love this story, then I highly recommend reading 100 Years Quest. So now I'd like to hear what you think. Is 100 Years Quest really worth reading? Who would you recommend it to? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then check out my recent video on Dead Rock. In that video, I explain what we can expect in Mashima's upcoming manga. You can find it in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.